plan on adoption or foster care to have a major role in her life. Even in college, she didn't major in anything that would indicate a career in the field of adoption. It was only after getting a job in social services that she developed a deep love for the field. Over time, she witnessed successful adoption and also interactions that went horribly wrong. She was so moved by these issues that she witnessed that she wrote 2 books on the topic. Find out more about Anne and learn from her cautionary tales to understand what she feels we need to do better for first mothers, children, and adoptive families. This time on Adoption Uncovered. Well, hello. If you could introduce yourself and then go ahead and kind of tell me how you got to where you are when it comes to adoption.
Okay. My name's Ann Moody. I'm the parent of 3 daughters, the youngest of whom is adopted from Korea. I'm the co-director of a small infant adoption agency, and I'm the author of 2 books on adoption. The way I got started in adoption was probably the same, well, I had the same influences of every kid growing up in the 1950s of being besieged, and happily besieged by appealing orphans everywhere, from Shirley Temple to Disney characters to Anne of Green Gables to, some like half the books I read were about orphans, and it made adoption seem very appealing. It didn't usually think about foster care, but I did when I was about 8. I read a book about a little girl in a foster home that happened to be next door to a pony farm, who ends up getting adopted by the owner of the pony farm and her caseworker. And it was an incredibly touching and influential book that made foster care also seem attractive to me. Next encountered adoption when I was about 12, and I read an article about a woman who had adopted a child from Korea. And I don't know, something just clicked, and I thought that's something I want to do someday. And happily, I grew up to be able to do that. I didn't think about adoption in terms of my career in school. I majored in urban planning as an undergrad and then went on to an MSW program, but in administration and policy, not in casework. And it was just by chance that I happened to apply for a job with the Michigan Department of Social Services in the foster care unit, just because we were staying in Ann Arbor for a while because my husband had found a job he really liked there and I needed a job. So, as fate would have it, that had a tremendous impact on not only my future career, but my life. I then spent 6 years working in the foster care system in Michigan, and that was sad and stressful and incredibly rewarding, and the best education I could have possibly gotten, about not just about foster care, but about life. However, I didn't want to stay in it. It was too stressful. I ended up coming back to Seattle, which is where we were from originally, and got a job with an adoption agency, a large agency specializing in international adoption. And I worked there for 10 years as an adoption counselor and as the supervisor of the birth parent counseling program. And that was when open adoption was brand new. This is probably 1980. And so the program was very successful because it promoted open adoption, and it grew to a 4-state area and 100 placements a year, and it was huge. And then as things changed, it sort of died back and private adoption took over in the infant adoption area. So after 10 years with that agency, I joined forces with a partner and we took over an existing agency and specialized in in-country infant adoption and birth mom counseling. And that's what I've been doing ever since. But officially I've sort of retired and I'm now concentrating on the books and finding that very rewarding. So the books are, the first one was about, is sort of, well, the motivation for that one was I realized I was telling the same stories over and over again to the families I worked with, and I thought it might be efficient to just write these down. They were illustrative stories about various points I wanted to make, and so I did, and it turned into sort of a memoir and sort of sort of about foster care, about adoption, about the state of adoption, about being an adoptive parent. It was kind of a mix of things. But when I finished that book, I realized I hadn't done enough. I hadn't finish saying all I wanted to say about what was happening with the current state of infant adoption, which I had watched get increasingly difficult and increasingly unethical over the years. So I wrote the second book about that. And that's where I am today.
So I'd love for you to walk us through that. What was it like when you were starting, and then how have things, what have you noticed over time, how it's
Okay.
changed?
Well, in the first part of my career, I infant adoptions were handled by agencies or by attorneys most of the time. The state had sort of handed infant adoption over to the private agencies, and things were pretty pretty predictable. Family adopting through an attorney or through an agency would have some knowledge about that person or that agency, and would know what to expect, would know approximately what it was going to cost, would know what was expected of them. That changed pretty dramatically, and I probably in the early 2000s, with internet advertising was a big issue that came in. So suddenly people were looking all over the nation for their babies instead of just, at the local adoption agency or the statewide adoption agency. And this meant people were working with people that, professionals, in quotes, that they really knew nothing about. They were far away and they didn't have any in-person contact with them usually. And also birth parents that they didn't know anything about. And birth parents were working with families they didn't know much about. And then the other thing that happened at about the same time, well, families started trying to compete on a much larger scale. The supply of babies started going down for various reasons, good reasons usually. It just became a lot harder to adopt. And what happened as a result of that was that people started offering money, offering to pay living expenses. And that really skewed everything. And the proliferation of adoption facilitation services. I mean, some of them are wonderful, some of them are not. Some agencies are wonderful, some are not. So this isn't a comment about any individual facilitator or agency, but as a general rule, facilitators are not required to meet the same standards as agencies are. They're free to operate with much less supervision. Consequently, what was happening is that they were offering financial remuneration in the form of living expenses to birth parents. And of course, if you're a birth mother who's struggling and you can work with a family who's wonderful, who is paying your living expenses, or a family who is wonderful, who is not paying your living expenses, why wouldn't you, choose the one who can help you? Um, but that skewed things quite a lot. What I found was that the families I was working with, and often these were my private practice families, not people I had done a home study for, and then they would look elsewhere for a baby. Were getting into a lot of difficulty. They were involved in a lot of scams. They were being approached by facilitators about sending a large chunk of money to be presented to a birth mother, and always they were picked by the birth mother, which I realized later was because they had agreed to pay expenses. There was no matching, or there was no conversation ahead of time. There was nothing other than, if you'll send me the check, I'll present you to this birth mom and she will pick you because she's eager to get things going. And it just was so counter to everything that I had known before about the ethics of working with birth parents. And I shouldn't even call them birth parents, it's pregnant women. At this point, they are not birth parents yet. Although the next thing that happened, which was truly alarming, was that I began to notice that my adoptive families were being approached by facilitators about women who had relinquished before, and not just once or twice before, but sometimes as much as 7 times before. And it was impossible to ignore the fact that that was a financially motivated pregnancy, and that the facilitator and the birth mom were both financially benefiting in an extremely destructive manner. So that really raised red flags for me. The facilitators did not see it that way. They saw repeat birth mothers as pretty convenient, for them, because they didn't need a lot of counseling, supposedly. I mean, I would definitely challenge that. These poor women must have been absolutely desperate.
A lot of Anne's experience is with mothers who are seeking to place their children in an adoptive family. Domestic baby adoption often gets a bad reputation for being the wrong choice for everyone involved. and helps us to see more nuance within this area of adoption.
On balance, that's a very good thing that there aren't babies needing homes, but it does make it awfully hard for adoptive parents.
Mhm. Is there any way in particular that you're able to deal with adoptive families that aren't maybe they can't find a child to adopt, or how do you
Well,
deal with that situation?
I kind of don't. I mean, I don't have any source of babies. I
Right, right.
direct people to international adoption or the foster care system or something. Um, but yeah, no, it's not going to be possible for everyone to adopt who wants to, and certainly financially. I mean, there are so many people who are excluded, on that front. People who would be wonderful parents, because it's gotten prohibitively expensive.
Hmm. Are there ways that you can imagine that it would make the system run better?
My suggestions that are, in the second book. Now, I think what needs to happen is, I think, first of all, that we need to establish standards of practice for and review for adoption professionals. Anybody who takes money from anybody else, for dealing with an adoption, um, needs to have some credentials. And not only do they need that, but they need to be visible to adoptive families and birth parents who might want to work with them. We ought to be able to see something other than Google reviews or Yelp or whatever, which are never reliable and usually they're few and far between and they're not reliable. We need to know who who these agencies and facilitators and attorneys are, what their credentials are, and that they have met whatever the standards the state has set for adoption professionals. That's the very least we should do. Right now, we have no oversight at all. There's no oversight, nobody even to complain to except sort of the Better Business Bureau. Because if they're not licensed, you can't complain to a licensor. We also need to establish national adoption law. Now that we have people going from state to state to adopt, which is, I think, probably the norm now. Most of my families get babies from out of state, get connected to birth parents in a different state. And just statistically, that's just how it happens. The state laws vary so much, and the ethics behind those state laws have such different interpretations that it's really hard to know. If you're an adoptive family going to Florida or something for an adoption, it's really hard to know what goes in Florida and what doesn't. It's really hard to know. I mean, certain states are easier than others. Certain states are more transparent or whatever, but it's you can get into a lot of difficulty without doing anything that you thought was wrong. So that's something, and I can't understand why this should be a state's issue anyway. It seems so clear that we should have national standards that everybody knows what's okay and what's not. The other thing that I would really, really love to see is some form of cooperation between the state social services and child welfare agencies and private adoption professionals, because I've had a number of situations where pregnant woman or a parent that I was dealing with had a child in foster care who wanted to place in an adoptive home, and the state just couldn't grasp, that this was a legitimate thing for this person to do. And there's no reason for that. We ought to be able to work together. We're all trying to, help this woman do what she wants to do, and it shouldn't take years and years and lots of legal battles. It should, if someone wants to relinquish voluntarily, that ought to be seen as a legitimate thing to do. So, and various other ways that we could work together too. And then finally, I think we should eliminate any we have a national policy eliminating adoptive parents making direct payment to prospective birth mothers, because it just sets up so many difficulties. And I'm going to just read to you from my book about that. It
Yeah, that'd be great.
exerts financial pressure on women to consider adoption or to follow through with an adoption. It pressures pregnant women to merely pretend they're considering adoption if they're really financially desperate. Because if you receive living expenses and then you don't follow through with the adoption, you don't have to pay those back. So there's unfortunately a lot of incentive to pretend that you're thinking about adoption. It encourages women to get pregnant in order to become pregnant in order to receive financial support, whether or not they're really considering adoption. It creates a dysfunctional financial liaison between adoption professionals and women who pursue multiple pregnancies and relinquishments. It increases the number of adoption scams. It increases the overall cost of adoption, including unsuccessful adoptions, and it erodes the trust and goodwill between birth and adoptive parents. And that's something that I feel really strongly about. It's most of the families I work with these days, or many of them, have experienced some sort of scam where they lost a significant amount of money financially. And though they recognize intellectually that this has nothing to do with their next adoption or the next birth mom they connect with, it's very, very hard not to feel anxious and suspicious. And that didn't used to factor into people's relationships the way it does now. And I think money is the root of all this problem. So,
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very tricky because it sounds like,
mm,
for one thing, if these the pregnant women
mm.
had money to survive, that they wouldn't be here potentially. Like,
Well, that's first. I want to make one caveat that
yeah.
I I absolutely don't. I mean, I'm the original bleeding heart liberal. I think that birth mothers, pregnant women, anybody in financial need needs help, but they don't need it from someone who's hoping to adopt their baby. They need
Yeah.
it from the state or some impartial observer. I also
Hmm.
feel, and this is from my ancient history, not from no, in my first half of my career, not from the second half. Um, I, I know that the common belief is that poverty is the behind most relinquishments. I didn't find that to be true with the women I worked with. Um, I don't doubt that that is true, and I certainly know sort of internationally that's true. But the women I worked with in the first half of my career were just like anybody else, as far as, I mean, they were the girl next door. They were people who were not, they typically lived with their families, or with their husband, or, I mean, they did not need financial assistance, nor did they ask for it. They were insulted by the idea that they would take money in exchange for their baby. And it was just, there was nothing to distinguish their lives, except that right now, sometimes because of youth, sometimes because the baby was not their husband's, or there was some, there was an abusive relationship, there was something that was just making them feel like they couldn't parent this child. Those were the reasons they would relinquish, not for financial reasons. Now, as time has gone on and drug issues have become far more prevalent, dysfunction in various ways seems more prevalent. I would say that a greater number of people, finances do play a greater part in it. But I would also say they shouldn't. If someone's relinquishing for financial reasons, then we need to steer them toward financial support, financial help somewhere, somehow. Because I mean, it is available. It's not easily or readily available, but it is available. No one in this country should have to relinquish their child because of money. And that's a whole nother, book at least. But yeah, it shouldn't be because of money. It should be because the I mean, the basic reason to relinquish is because you feel at this time in your life you're not able to give this child the home that you want them to have. And if you won the lottery tomorrow, maybe you would be able to hire help or do, there'd be something, but it wouldn't change um, your preparation for parenthood or whatever. It wouldn't have that. Well, that's too extreme an example, but if you were somehow not so strapped financially, it still wouldn't make you feel prepared to parent this child at this time. And I hope that's what's behind most relinquishments. I hope it isn't just poverty, though I think that's an easy answer. I think that's an easy explanation, and it
Right.
into it, but it's not the whole thing.
And I think that's really interesting insight to have because I think a lot of us, coming from the outside looking in, we look and think, "Oh, well, if they just had this or if they just had
Mhm.
this, maybe they would go ahead and parent." But it's interesting to hear from you, from the people you've talked to, that there can be times in your life when it's just not the right time.
Mhm.
And it sounds like maybe the right choice for some of these women is to have another family raise their child.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, do you
Or,
find that a lot of these women have continued contact with the child in some way, or do you know much about
you
that?
know, by these women, which do you mean? The ones who are taking money or the ones who are?
The ones that you've worked with that voluntarily have um
Oh, yeah. The ones that I've worked
Mhm.
with, I mean, over the years, we always promoted openness, believing it was the best thing for the child, believing also it was the best thing for the birth parents and by extension for the adoptive parents, since everybody would feel relaxed and happy with each other. In the vast majority of our relationships, everybody did feel happy with each other. We just a handful of people where things just went wrong and they didn't maintain contact. Now, that contact doesn't mean lots of contact or in-person contact necessarily, but it means the birth parents pick the couple. They usually meet, at the time of before placement, and then again at the hospital. Sometimes lots of meetings in between, depending what stage of the pregnancy is, and then they have ongoing contact afterwards. I'm a huge proponent of letters written to the birth parent about the child, because those have proven to be very helpful over the years, both to creating a record, if there's any dispute about anything, you've got a record of what was going on when. But more importantly, to give the child the message that the birth parent is someone who's important to you. You want to share information about the child. You enjoy sharing information about the child with them, and you're all on the same page as far as the adoption. There's no secrecy, there's no ill will. Everybody agreed. Your birth mom, chose this family and feels good about it, and it's on. Everybody knows that everybody's continuing to do well. That's the norm. We have some families who have a whole lot of contact, but usually they don't. Usually it's more like extended family, but just living, they usually live in different parts of the country, and, a handful get together regularly, but most don't. And it's just depends on the individuals involved. But the message that we felt so strongly about, which is that the child understand that this was a decision made mutually out of love and concern for the child, that message is usually gotten across.
Because infant adoption is often viewed as wrong or bad, mothers who choose it often don't get the support they need from their communities and those around them.
I don't know, I actually have written a third book, which isn't about paying birth mothers, but it's a YA novel for middle grade about birth moms. It's about a girl who's pregnant and planned an adoption, has an open adoption, and then there's a Chinese adoptee who's looking for her birth mother, and it sort of equates the two experiences and what those two girls have in common, even though they're, I mean, the young birth mother in China and the young birth mother here, what's similar about their stories, and it's aimed at helping people, um, at building empathy, in a young audience. And I wrote it because I would hear when I would talk to younger girls, young teenagers about pregnancy, the typical response would be, I could never do, I mean, not about pregnancy, about adoption. Their typical response would be, I could never do that to my baby. I would never do that. My child, adoption is a bad thing. I would never do that. And, I thought this is just so sad, that girls who do choose adoption are so misunderstood, by their peers. And I also worked with birth moms in the past who, would after relinquishing would expect to find, support and encouragement from their peers, and instead found this, well, I could never have done that. I don't know how you could do that. And it was just such a sad misunderstanding of their motivation and how they were feeling, and the idea that they didn't love their child, and it was sad. So I was trying to get to the root of the problem, which is the young audience instead of adults. And I don't know other than dramatic stories like that, or approaching it through a movie or a book, or something, or a real life sad story that hits the news. It's hard to make change in a more technical or more less dramatic sort of way. And I don't know what the best approach is, but I hope this will I hope this new book will help young girls change attitudes about who relinquishes and who doesn't, and what the
Well, it is horrible to think too that someone who has gone through this really hard thing
Mhm.
has decided that it's best to have someone else raise their child, even if they get contact and then they go out in society and they're just hit
Yeah,
and hit with these opinions
yeah,
that they were whatever, selfish, or what they did was wrong, or whatever. It's like they need support. If
yes.
they came to that really hard decision that was right for them.
Right. A very strong group of people feel like there is no good reason to relinquish a child. There's no birth mother who doesn't regret her decision. Well, I know lots and lots of birth mothers who don't regret their decision. They regret having had to make that decision. They regret the circumstances that put them there, and they wish things could have been different, but they don't want to undo it. They sort of recognize the reality of the situation, that it was what they it was what was best for them and the child at the time. You can't wish that away, sort of. I mean, you had to operate with reality at that time. It's unrealistic and it's unkind, to act later like, well, you must suffer for your whole life for having done this, and it's not accurate, and it's not useful. It's not true. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard those too where adoption needs to end
Mhm.
and we need to, you know, keep adoptees with their first families, and I think a lot of that is that adoptees are missing their full identity and that connection
Mhm.
and that
Mhm.
and all of that. And it's like, yeah, those are issues we need to solve too. There's
Yeah.
a lot of issues, but um I think often a blanket solution is kind of missing that
Mhm.
there are times when different solutions work for different
Yes.
people if you can do it in an ethical way, and that's the hard part.
Mhm.
It's like
Yeah.
adoption, especially infant adoption, has a lot of flaws that can harm children and adults involved with the system. Many people want to throw out the system of adopting babies entirely. Based on this conversation with Anne Moody, it might be possible to see a way where families can be formed in this way, but it's difficult to sidestep all the problems and pitfalls. Learn more about Anne's knowledge and perspective and find links to her books on my website, adoptionuncover.com. And thank you.